Nerves are built with a nerve body, an axon, and an axon terminal. It's the job of the axon terminal to connect with effector tissues. Let's say that it's the pain receptors in the skin of your arm and also the muscles of the arm. The axon terminal can also connect to muscles, endocrine glands, organs, skin, or other tissues. The function of the axon is to transmit nerve impulses from the body to the axon terminal and sometimes from the axon terminal up into the nerve body. The axon terminal can be myelinated or unmyelinated. So myelin is a fatty substance that coats the axon, and as an insulator, it has the effect of causing a nerve impulse to skip over these fatty sections. So it effectively shortens the transmission of the nerve impulse. The function of the axon is to transmit nerve impulses. Depending on the type of nerve cell, that can be impulses from the body into the brain. Those are called afferent. Or that can be from the brain into the body, and those are called efferent. And the way I remember those is that letter A comes before letter E. You have to get the information from the body up into the brain first. A comes first, and then from the brain down into the body. E comes after A. E comes second. Afferent first, efferent second. A lot of the afferent nerve cells are sensory, and a lot of the efferent nerve cells are motor. You can have a lot of nerve cells that are sensory and motor. Also, many of them will be autonomic, so they will be afferent, motor, and they can be afferent, motor, and autonomic altogether. Some will be only one, some will be two, some will be all three. But you don't need to know that for the mblex. It just helps you with the context. The function of the body is to react to stimuli, and in order to maintain homeostasis, the nerve body receives information through the axons, and then it manufactures chemicals to send back down into the axon terminal. So inside of every nerve cell body, you have all the same organelles that you would have in other cells. You have a nucleus, you have lysosomes and ribosomes, you have smooth endoplasmic reticulum, and you have rough endoplasmic reticulum, and you have mitochondria. All of these structures form some purpose, manufacturing proteins, manufacturing hormones, pre-hormones. Some of the products that nerve cells manufacture are hormones, and some are neurotransmitters. Examples of hormones that are manufactured by nerve cells, by nerve cell bodies, are vasopressin, for example. Vasopressin is a hormone, which also known as antidiuretic hormone, which helps to reserve water or conserve water in the body. Nerve bodies can also manufacture neurotransmitters such as acetylcholine. Coming off of every nerve cell body are these long tree-like extensions called dendrites. Dendrite comes, I think, from the Latin meaning tree. And it's the role of the dendrites to interface with other nerve cell bodies or with other axon terminals. So in an area where you have two nerve cell bodies connecting together, that area is called a nucleus. It's called a nucleus in the central nervous system, and it's called a ganglion outside of the central nervous system. Well, you can't see that very well. Okay, so it's called a ganglion. It's also very messy. It's called a ganglion in the peripheral nervous system, where cell bodies meet and interact, or where cell bodies and axon terminals meet and interact. So nucleus or nuclei are important to remember because we find nuclei in places like the hypothalamus, and where you get a bunch of cell bodies, a bunch of nerve cell bodies all together inside of a nuclei in the hypothalamus, they start producing things like vasopressin or acetylcholine, and they're responsible for specific actions like maintaining the water balance or other kinds of homeostasis in the body. So when we mention nuclei in the hypothalamus, it means a collection of nerve bodies or nerve bodies and axons that are interacting together, collecting information through afferent impulses and then sending back information through efferent impulses. So in the very simple example here, using the arm, let's say that there's some pain impulse like something very hot that's touching the arm. An afferent, A comes first, an afferent nerve impulse of pain would be sent through the axon terminals, up through the axon, into the brain or the spinal cord, into a nucleus, where one cell body would interface with another cell body, and an efferent impulse would be sent back down, and, um, and then an efferent impulse would be sent back down through the axon to the axon terminal into the effector organs, let's say muscles, and that would cause the arm to pull away, as in a pain reflex. What I want you to know about the hypothalamus is that it is part of the brain. So you have this is my version of the brain, right? So this is the cortex. Here's the cerebellum, hangs from the bottom of the brain like a bell. There's the brain stem. And you have the corpus callosum. This is a structure you do not need to know. In the front, there is a border, and then you have the hypothalamus, usually drawn something like this. And then hanging from the hypothalamus, you have the pituitary gland. I want to tell you about a couple structures that you don't need to know for the exam, but that will help you because it'll give you a little context. Behind the hypothalamus is the thalamus. So you can think of, so hopefully that makes sense to you, that there is the thalamus, below it is the hypothalamus. In back of the thalamus is the pineal gland, which you probably have heard of. On the bottom border of the hypothalamus is a structure called the mammillary bodies. There are two of them, one left and one right, and they're named because they resemble boobs. They're named after mammaries. You also have, on the brainstem, you have pons, and you have the medulla oblongata. Here you have the bottom of the skull, cranium, enclosed by the skull. Goes all the way around. I guess I should draw it all the way around, right? Now let's blow this part up, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Within the hypothalamus, there are about 4 different sections, each with distinct nuclei for different functions. Remember or recall that nuclei are bundles of nerves, specifically the nerve cell bodies, where multiple nerve cell bodies meet with each other to exchange information. And this is called a nucleus inside the central nervous system and a ganglion in the peripheral nervous system. So you have all these nuclei, and some of them manufacture hormones, and some manufacture neurotransmitters. As afferent impulses come in through sensory nerves, they bring the information into the nuclei, and the nuclei, being cell bodies, decide what to do with it. And they send that information down into the pituitary gland through efferent fibers. I remember afferent is the first impulse, that's a sensory impulse. The first impulse comes into the brain, and efferent, E comes after A, efferent is the second impulse that goes from the brain further down, in this case, still within the brain from the hypothalamus into the pituitary gland. So the function of the hypothalamus is to receive and react to stimuli. Its main purpose is to maintain homeostasis within the body, but it also has some nuclei that deal with optics, that deal with vision, and other stuff. The pituitary gland is also part of the brain. Remember, that's inside the brain. That means they're in the central nervous system. And these are just a few of the functions that the hypothalamus regulates. Think of the hypothalamus as a body balancer. Hunger, satiety, that's fullness, thirst, temperature, mood, sex drive, that's libido, sleep, and blood pressure. Okay, so here we have a very large hypothalamus and a very large pituitary gland. You have the anterior pituitary gland, which has its own blood supply, and you have the posterior pituitary gland, which is mostly neural tissue. Posterior is mostly neural tissue, anterior is mostly glandular tissue with its own blood supply. So for the mblex, I think the most important pieces of information to know are that the posterior pituitary gland stores ADH, antidiuretic hormone, also called vasopressin, and oxytocin. The anterior pituitary gland makes and releases flat PEG, that's follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, prolactin, endorphins, and growth hormone. The hypothalamus manufactures ADH and oxytocin, sends it down the axons where it's deposited and stored in the posterior pituitary gland until it needs to be released. Now, what causes each of these hormones to be released from the posterior pituitary gland? ADH is released in response to dehydration. That's also low blood volume and low blood pressure. Oxytocin is released in response to uterine contractions, the infant suckling on the areola, and the male ejaculation response. For the anterior pituitary gland, the hypothalamus manufactures releasing hormones and sends them to the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary absorbs those releasing hormones into its own vascular supply, where it transports them to its cells that then manufacture and release the flat PEG hormones. The releasing hormones that the hypothalamus manufactures are thyrotropin releasing hormone, which causes thyroid stimulating hormone to be released, corticotropin releasing hormones, which cause adenocorticotropic hormone to be released, gonadotropin releasing hormones, which causes follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone to be released, growth hormone releasing hormones, which causes growth hormone to be released, also dopamine and somatostatin. Now, you don't need to remember each one of these, but you do need to get the concept. Releasing hormones are manufactured by the hypothalamus for the anterior pituitary. They cause the anterior pituitary to manufacture and release the following hormones. Follicle stimulating hormone, which causes the production of eggs and sperm. Luteinizing hormone, which causes the production of estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, which leads to the production of epinephrine, cortisol, and the androgens. Thyroid stimulating hormone, which allows the production of thyroxine or thyroid hormone. Prolactin, which enables the production of breast milk. Endorphins, which induce pleasure sensations and reduce pain. And growth hormone, which allows young people to develop and adults to build and repair their bodies. So now let's talk about this axis. So here you have the hypothalamus, and here you have the pituitary gland, and here you have the adrenal gland sitting on top of the kidney. This system is called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, also called HPA. HPA. What I want you to remember about these axes is that there's a top-down relationship with a feedback loop. So if additional epinephrine is needed from the adrenal glands, the process looks like this. The hypothalamus, after sending corticotropin-releasing hormone to the pituitary gland, causes the manufacture and the release of adenocorticotropic hormone, which then travels through the blood to the adrenals, and that acts on the adrenals to produce, in this case, epinephrine. When epinephrine is manufactured in significant enough or adequate amounts, that level will be detected by the hypothalamus, which then shuts off the production of corticotropic releasing hormone, and in response, the pituitary shuts off the manufacture of adrenocorticotropic releasing hormone, and in the absence of ACTH, the adrenals then stop the production of epinephrine. This is called negative feedback, an example of negative feedback where the presence of a hormone becomes adequate and stops the process. And this process looks the same whether it's the adrenal glands or whether it's the gonads or whether it's the thyroid, right? So you can have the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or you can have the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, or you can have the hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis. These are all just models of illustrating the production of releasing hormones and stimulating hormones and tissue hormones, and then positive or negative feedback that stops or continues the process.